expected. The unthinkable is what we're supposed to expect. This is the 9th speech out of the Advanced Communicator Bronze. So Brian doesn't have anything in particular he wants me to watch for, just basic overall quality, which I expect to be very high, even though this is a smidge on the impromptu side. Enjoy.
And there, just
oh, is there more?
Yeah, there will be a Q&A of 3 minutes.
Oh,
this is a fact-finding report. The Q&A at the end of 2 to 3 minutes, so I'll speak for 5 to 7. And the intent is for me to bring out facts, not just in the speech, but also in the Q&A. So I'm going to leave tidbits of thoughts for you to think about and then ask me about at the end.
So Brian has taken a job in Inglewood, and he is going to take a pause from Pikes Peak Toastmasters for about a year, and then I guess the firm is planning to move to Colorado Springs, and he expects to come back at that point. The speech is the 9th and final in the Advanced Communicator Bronze Manual. And we have 5 to 7 minutes plus 2 to 3 minutes for Q&A. How do we handle that for the timer?
That's a good question. What I'll do is, after you stop speaking, then I'll stop, and then I'll set it for 2 to 3 minutes. I guess that's what I'll do.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay.
That's how you do it.
Please welcome Brian Freese.
Fellow Toastmasters, and yes, December 6th, 1917, Halifax, Nova Scotia. A ship bound for Europe to assist in the war effort was leaving port. A few minutes into its journey, not yet out of the harbor, it had a minor collision with another ship. Not particularly significant. It caused a small fire to start. After a few minutes, the crew realized they could not contain the fire, and they abandoned ship. The ship drifted a little while in the harbor before its cargo, 2,500 tons of explosives, blew up. The effect was devastating. The shock wave was felt and shattered windows 60 miles away. In fact, decades later in World War II, atomic scientists would study this event, which was the worst explosion to that time in history, as a template for determining and predicting how nuclear blasts would affect the surrounding countryside. The press would look at something like that today and say, it was awful. It was catastrophic. It was terrible. And perhaps some people would say it was unthinkable. Who would ever guess something like that could happen? Reverend Samuel Prince was having breakfast that day in Nova Scotia, in Halifax. He survived the explosion and went on to become a first responder. What he saw amazed him. People who you would not expect to step forward did. People helped other people in spite of their injuries. Other people were terrified, frozen, and paralyzed. Reverend Prince went on to get his PhD a few years later at Columbia, where he chronicled this part of human behavior in his thesis entitled Catastrophes and Social Change. He said, because of his desire to see people and humanity get better because of disasters, that the ability to cope with disasters will improve only after people understand and become more aware of it and understand many catastrophes. It would be a harbinger for things to come. Amanda Ripley, a Time magazine author, explores human behavior in situations like this in her book, The Unthinkable. She talks about such things as the fact that our emotions and our personalities change in disasters, whereas they're much different than what they are normally as we are sitting here. But our personality changes are not unknowable. For example, a few facts. The first responders in all disasters are not the first responders. They're people like us, bystanders stepping forward to help. They're the ones that save most of the lives in disasters. After 9/11, the government spent $23 billion trying to educate state and local governments about how to deal with calamities. But none of that was spent, or very little, if any of it was spent, educating regular people like us on what to do. Simple things that you could do to prepare, or at least mentally be ready for these kinds of events. Why is that important? 80% of the American public lives in areas where they have to depend on the local infrastructure for such basic things as food, electricity, water, and the big one, medical attention. Ms. Ripley goes on to talk about some other things as what kind of behaviors do people exhibit in these kinds of situations? Denial, well, this isn't as bad as it looks. Maybe such things as paralysis. Some people have tunnel vision, where everything kind of closes in and you forget about to be aware of certain things around you and you're focusing on just one little thing and maybe that isn't enough. She also asks a question which is a theme throughout her book: what can people do? Is there something you can do to improve your chances of survival? Such things as maybe being prepared, which sounds like an oxymoron, because how do you prepare for any kind of disaster when you don't know what's going to happen anyway? But there are things that you can do. Fire drills, realistic training, things, and also considering what could happen in certain situations, as if you're in a crowded theater or a restaurant. What would happen if, when you're driving, what would happen if that person lost control? What would happen if I had a blowout in my car? Then she asks, and brings out another interesting fact. Why is it that some people are so resilient? Some people don't freak out in cases like this. They maintain their cool and poise and recover faster and are able to function more quickly than others who are paralyzed. How is it that some people from different walks of life are more resilient? And why is it that Special Forces soldiers all have a particular component in their bloodstream that enables them to cope with stress and not lose their cool? That's probably why they're called Special Forces, right? Also, why is it that one of the glands in your brain is a little smaller in people who are more prone to PTSD than in others who are not? Lastly, she takes up the theme again: what can you do to improve your chances of survival? It turns out that it only takes a little bit. There's a thin line between surviving and dying, and a thin line between what you can do to improve your chances just a little bit that'll make that key difference. Such things as, very simple, be in better physical shape. Know the people around you in a neighborhood. All those things and more she takes up in her book. It'll help you be prepared for and perhaps have a better chance of surviving Unthinkable. Q&A.
When I was a kid in the school district I was in, first aid was required for every student in high school. And sometime later, I was living in Southern California in 1994 during the Northridge quake. And that event required me to draw on that first aid knowledge that I had in order to help people in my neighborhood. And I noticed that a lot of the kids, a lot of the students from my school were participating in helping out. Do you think that kids learning first aid might help people be more prepared?
Absolutely. It helps them be more prepared also. It helps them think about that. It's not the training, because you can't train for every single scenario, but the training helps you become more confident and be aware of what can happen. That little bit of preparation and that little bit of forethought can make the difference. It's a huge difference. The other thing is that, remember that cliche? Those who are in situations where they do not get killed and become stronger. It makes a difference. It's just that little tiny bit of preparation and forethought is a huge factor in survival. Yes?
Brian, do you know of places where they teach preparedness just basic preparedness to be aware of, not putting fear into people, but at least establish some credibility and information so we could go on and take it with us?
Ms. Ripley addresses that in her book. The answer is sadly, no. All this money that gets spent for the emergency preparedness centers and those kinds of installations, but telling people basic stuff, what they can do in these kinds of cases is virtually non-existent. And that is why, what do the governments tell us? They say, be prepared, be ready. How? That's what people want to know. Some governments in other countries ask questions like, they say things like giving specific examples, what to do in case of a tsunami, specific instructions to people people who are targeted, people who live near the coastlines, and it's easy to understand. You don't see that here.
I got one more question on that. You mentioned the armed forces in the military. What about them?
There, couple things. They go through specialized training, especially the special forces soldiers, that is very realistic. And interestingly enough, the training is so realistic and stressful that it screens out those people who do not have that component, which is called neuropeptide Y, in their bloodstreams. Those soldiers tend to have the ability to recover more quickly from these kinds of disasters than others do. And they interestingly are screened out because of the brutalness and rigorousness of their training. Yes.
With a lot of recent activities, particularly in Colorado, you have school districts now training people to respond to a shooter. Is that actually a good thing? I understand if it's a natural disaster, but are we conditioning ourselves to live in violence?
With all the guns.
It can be a good thing because the idea is not to condition people to violence, but to condition people to respond to be prepared and understand that things can happen which are beyond their control, and be mentally prepared to adapt to it, not necessarily be able to address that particular disaster, but be prepared to know that it could happen. Something can happen. So it's not a matter of conditioning. It's a good point. It's not conditioning. It's a matter of understanding that things can happen. Last example, my dad was a superb driver, and he knew how to drive in all kinds of conditions. And the way he did that is he went out on the lakes in eastern South Dakota, which are frozen so thick you could drive a semi over them. But he went out there and drove on the ice and got a feel for how the car behaved. Result, he never had an accident. And he could drive in the worst kind of conditions totally, I mean totally without fear. That's just one example and one case of a disaster that could happen to you personally while you're on the road. I'll entertain other questions after the meeting.